गणानां त्वा गणपतिगं वदामहे कविं कवीनाम् उपमश्रवस्तमम् ज्येष्ठराजं ब्रह्मणां ब्रह्मणस्पद आनशृण्वन्नोतिभिस्सीदसादनम् ॐ श्री सद्गुरु महागणाधिपतये नमः। नारायणाय विद्महे वासुदेवाय धीमहि तन्नो विष्णु प्रचोदयात्। महादेवी च विद्महे विष्णुपत्नी च धीमहि तन्नो लक्ष्मी प्रचोदयात्। तत्पुरुषाय विद्महे महासेनाय धीमहि तन्नः षण्मुख प्रचोदयात्। भूतनाथाय विद्महे भवपुत्राय धीमहि तन्नः शास्ता प्रचोदयात्। आदित्याय च सोमाय मंगलाय बुधाय च गुरुशुक्रशनिभ्यश्च राघवे केतवे नमो नमः। आञ्जनेयाय विद्महे वायुपुत्राय धीमहि तन्नो हनुमत् प्रचोदयात्। कात्यायनाय विद्महे कन्याकुमारी धीमहि तन्नो दुर्गे प्रचोदयात्। तत्पुरुषाय विद्महे महादेवाय धीमहि तन्नो रुद्र प्रचोदयात्। सरस्वती नमस्तुभ्यं वरदे कामरूपिणी विद्यारंभं करिष्यामि सिद्धिर्भवतु मे सदा। सर्वमंगलमांगल्ये शिवे सर्वार्थसाधिके शरण्ये त्र्यंबके गौरी नारायणि नमोस्तुते। नमो व्रातपतये नमो गणपतये नमः प्रमदपतये नमस्ते अस्तु लंबोदराय एकदन्ताय विघ्नविनाशिने दिवसदाय श्रीवरदमूर्तये नमो नमः। वक्रतुंड महाकाय सूर्यकोटि समप्रभा निर्विघ्नं कुरु मे देव सर्वकार्येषु सर्वदा विनाशकाति समस्त हरिहर देवताभ्यो नमो नमः। सर्व अपराध क्षमार्थं सर्वमंगल प्राप्त्यर्थम् अलंकार पंचमुख दीपं दर्शयामि आचमनीयं समर्पयामि दिव्य रक्षां धारयामि इंद्रस्तोमेन पञ्चदशेन मध्यमिदं वातेन सकरेण रक्षा रक्षां धारयामि। ओम वराहो
Namaste, Jannavi.
Namaskaram.
Namaste. Thank you. And no one needs introduction. Jannavi about Jannavi. And Jannavi, the stage is yours. And just leave him. Your dad is also just joining. And please leave about 10 minutes for discussion. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And we'll conclude by 8 o'clock. Yeah.
Of course. Namaskaram to everyone. Before I begin, I would like to thank Dr. Raju uncle once again for conceiving this idea on this series on Vagyakaras, or great composers of the Indian classical music diaspora. As a student of music, it provided me with a wonderful opportunity to contemplate on the lives and compositions of these great composers in this music field. I would also like to once again thank this assembly for the opportunity to be here with you all. Before I start, I would like to offer my namaskarams to all of my gurus, past, present, and future, without whom I would not be here today. Any success I may achieve is always attributed to them, and any flaws and mistakes are solely my own. Previously, the last session in this series of Vagyakaras focused on Saint Tyagaraja, one of the trinity of Carnatic music composers. Today, we will focus on Sri Muthuswami Dikshithar, the second of the trinity. Being that traditionally in initial pujas or offerings or any sort of endeavor, we take Lord Ganesha's name first. I would like to start by offering my salutations to Lord Ganesha through a beautiful composition in the Ragam Nate. It is actually one of the Shodasha Ganapati Kritis, or 16 Ganapati Kritis, composed by Sri Muthuswami Dikshithar, composed in Tiruvarur. Mahaganapatim set in Nate, in Chatushra Ekatalam. Mahaganapati Ganapati Manasa Smarami 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 Vashishravamadevaदिवन्दितमहागणपतिं मनसा स्मरामि वशिष्ठवामदेवादिवन्दितमहागणपतिं मनसा स्मरामि वशिष्ठवामदेवादिवन्दितमहागणपतिम् Mahadevasutam Guru Guhanutam Mahadevasutam Guru Guhanutam Mahadevasutam Guru Guhanutam Mahadevasutam Guru Guhanutam Koti Prakasham Shantam Magadevasutam Guru Guhanutam Madakoti Prakasham Shantam Magakavyanatagadi Priyam Magakavyanatagadi Priyam Mushikavana Modaka Priyam Magakavyanatagadi Priyam Mushikavana Modaka Priyam Mahaganapatim Manasa Smarami Vashishtabhamadevadivandita Mahaganapatim Sri Muthuswami Dikshit was born in the year 1775 to Sri Ramaswamy Dikshit in Tiruvarur. His father, Sri Ramaswamy Dikshit, was a well-known scholar, composer, and musician. Originally from Kanchipuram, Sri Ramaswamy Dikshit had pursued music both as a vocalist and as a veena player. He also incidentally studied with Venkata Vaidyanatha Dikshita of Madhyarjuna, who is the grandson of Venkatamakin. For those familiar with Venkatamakin, he was the originator and the first creator and the person who proposed the idea of the 72 Melakarta system, which is what is traditionally regarded as the widespread system for today. Ramaswamy Dikshit has a variety of compositions to his credit. He composed Tanavarnams, Padavarnams, Ragamalikas, and many other kritis in a variety of ragams as well as in a variety of talams. One of the noteworthy compositions that Muthuswami Dikshit's father composed is actually a Raga Tala Malika, which both contains 108 ragams as well as a variety of talams to match those 108 ragams. And many of those are actually very rare talams that we do not see a lot in concerts today. Unfortunately, the complete text for this composition is not available. We only have about 61 ragas and the corresponding talams in notation today. One other point of note that I would like to say about Muthuswami Dikshit's father is that he is very, very well known and gained quite a bit of fame for his improvisation in the ragam that was at that point known as Hamsadvani. Ramaswamy Dikshit is said to have composed the very first composition in Hamsadvani. A very interesting point of note, especially when you think about Muthuswami Dikshit's composition Vatapi Ganapatim that is quite popular in the ragam Hamsadvani. It was in this illustrious, music-laden, very technical and Sangeetam-filled atmosphere that Muthuswami Dikshit was born in March of 1775. Some accounts do say that he was born in 1776. For the purposes of this presentation, we'll take 1775. Ramaswamy Dikshit named the boy Muthuswami after his family deity Kartikeya and subsequently also had 3 more children, 2 brothers, Baluswami and Chinnaswamy, as well as a daughter, or Muthuswami Dikshit's sister, Valambad. Muthuswami Dikshit received a traditional education. He received a traditional education in the Vedas, in the Vedangas, as well as Karnataka Sangeetam. He, just like his father, trained as both a vocalist as well as a Vainika. By the age of 16, Muthuswami Dikshit had gained a great deal of familiarity with the arts of Jyotisha, with Ayurveda, as well as Tantra by the age of 16, again, as I said. Um, Dikshitar's family actually moved when he was quite young. And during that time, when they moved, as they moved around, Dikshitar often heard a lot of Western music. He heard British bands at Fort St. George, which was the official seat of the East India Company in South India. He heard them play Irish airs, Celtic jigs, and a lot of Western music. And we'll see how that impacts his compositions later on. When Muthuswami was about 25 years of age, he was instructed by his guru as well as his father to go to Varanasi. His guru was Chidambaranatha Yogi. He traveled to Varanasi with his guru, and he spent a great deal of time learning about Advaita Siddhanta, learning about Tantra and Sri Vidya Upasana, which we'll see plays a huge role in the latter part of his life. One of the most important pieces of note during his stay in Varanasi, Muthuswami Dikshitar had a great deal of opportunity to listen to Hindustani music, specifically the very elaborate Drupad style. For those familiar with Hindustani music, there are two major styles, Drupad being the older or more ancient style, and this was the style that was popularized at that time. Muthuswami Dikshitar had a lot of time and had a lot of experience and exposure to many artists, yesteryear artists of the Drupad style of singing. And he was able to not only listen to that, but also become inspired by a lot of that for his compositions later on in his life. At the end of 7 years, a long period in Varanasi, Dikshitar's guru advised him to return to the south. He had learned enough of what he needed to learn from his guru in Varanasi. And his guru said, go to the south, go visit Tirthani and begin your spiritual and musical journey. After his guru attained Samadhi, Dikshitar returned to his family, shifting back to Tiruvarur from the previous southern Indian city that they were in. Muthuswami Dikshitar then visited Tirthani. There's a beautiful legend that says that an older gentleman actually came up to Dikshitar and gave him some sugar. And after taking that sugar, the story says that that older gentleman was actually Lord Muruga in disguise, the Tirthani Murugan. After taking that sugar, Muthuswami Dikshitar then began to compose kritis. He was around the age of 30 or so, or 33 or so at this time. His first kriti that he composed was Srinatadi Guru Guho Jayanti and Maya Malagole. I will see again this theme of Guru Guha being represented. You heard it in the first song in Mahaganapatim as his mudra, and you'll still see that idea of Guru Guha, where his start was from in Muruga in Tirthani, coming all the way throughout all of his compositions. On his way home, Dikshitar actually spent some time in Kanchipuram with a yogi named Sri Ramachandra Saraswati, also known as Upanishad Brahmendra. From him, he learned not just compositions, he learned about the art of music as well as more Vedanta over the course of his time there. Something of note is that Sri Upanishad Brahmendra, this yogi, is also said to be one of Saint Tyagaraja's early teachers as well. We'll notice as we understand and learn more about the Trinity, there are a lot of connections between all three of the Trinity, between their gurus, between the influences that they had, as well as the various instances that they met each other. And that is such a beautiful thing, and we'll see that kind of grow and progress as we go through each of the Trinity of Carnatic music. In 1809, Muthuswami Dikshitar returned to Tiruvarur, back to his family. This was sort of the golden period of composition for Dikshitar. He composed many noteworthy compositions during this time, some of them being the Shodasha Ganapati Kritis, as I mentioned earlier, the 16 very famous Kritis on Ganapati. He composed the Kamalamba Navavarna Kritis, arguably the most prolific set of kritis that Dikshitar has composed, all based on Kamalamba and beautiful ragams with sahityam that relates to philosophy, relates to description, as well as to the Vedas and the Vedanga. He also composed a set of kritis on Tyagaraja, as well as Nilotpalambika during this time, again, touted as the golden period of Dikshitar's prime composing years at this time. In 1817, Ramaswamy Dikshitar passed away. During this time, the Dikshitar brothers, Muthuswami and his two brothers, were finding it difficult to set up a living in Tiruvarur, and they decided to move. They decided to move to Tanjavur. At this time, Tanjavur was a great center of culture and learning, and they decided to try their luck there. In Tanjavur, it is also said, again, another connection to the Trinity. The Dikshitar brothers actually met Shyama Sastri, who is the third member of the Trinity. There's a beautiful story that goes when they all met together. You have Dikshitar and his two brothers, Balaswami and Chinnaswamy, as well as Shyama Sastri. And there was a Varnam that they were putting together at this time. At that time, they only had one Chittaswaram, one note section or one Kalpanaswaram section of the Varnam that was composed. And it is said that the Chittaswarams were added on. One Chittaswaram was composed by Shyama Sastri, one by Muthuswami, one by Balaswami, and one by Chinnaswami. This beautiful Vadam and Shriranjani is part of this wonderful story, again highlighting the connection between the Trinity that existed, and the fact that they did have interaction with each other and were influenced by each other as well. At Tanjavur, the Dikshtar brothers wanted to find a way to earn a living and began to accept music students. Some of their first students were actually 4 brothers, Chinnaya Pillai, Ponnaya Pillai, Shivananda Pillai, and Vadivelu Pillai. These 4 were dancers, were musicians, were composers at the time, and later gained quite a deal of fame as the Tanjavur Quartet. For those familiar with Bharatanatyam and the Bharatanatyam Sampradayam, the Tanjavur Quartet are pioneers of the Bharatanatyam Margam as we know it today. They composed many Tanavarnams, many Padavarnams, Tillanas, as well as the Adavis, and really gave Bharatanatyam itself the musical repertoire and foundation that it has today. So it's very interesting to see, again, how different musical traditions kind of come together, with Bharatanatyam coming together through Dikshtar's lineage. Years later, Muthuswami Dikshtar left Tanjavur. His brothers had already left Tanjavur to go to different places. They wanted to try their luck elsewhere, and Muthuswami followed his brother's example. And he left Tanjavur to go on a pilgrimage. He visited very many temples over the course of this pilgrimage. And along the way, he composed kritis in honor of the deities he visited. Every single temple he went to, he would see the Lord or see the Devi, compose a kriti, and then move on to the next. A virtual pilgrimage of devotion, of music, of composition, and of creativity. Later on, he then settled in H.E.A.L.ing at the request of Venkateshwara Edappa I, who was the then Raja of H.E.A.L.ing in the Tirunelveli district, for those familiar. At this time, he spent some time with the king's patronage, again, composing at that time. A few years later, both of his wives passed away. Some sources actually say that Dikshtar had a daughter who lived in Tiruchirappalli, but not much is known about her. We do not have a lot of records of her. And as I'll maybe comment on later, Dikshtar's lineage from that side is not necessarily well known. During this time, over the course of his travels, it is said that Dikshtar did not seek patronage from anyone. He voluntarily accepted poverty. He accepted it with equanimity as his status in life. He did not go to seek money. He did not go try and find a way to earn a lot of money. He was very content with his status in life. And you'll see in his compositions, as you explore the sahityam of his compositions, he's not necessarily asking for riches or anything like that. He's really spending his time in spirituality, in contemplation, in understanding the different arts and sciences that he knew and putting them together in really a beautiful manner. As we know, Muthuswami Dikshtar was intensely devoted and was a Sri Vidya Upasakat. Again, something that he had learned much earlier when he was in Varanasi, something that he carried on through the rest of his life. And that formed a big part of his life. And we'll see again how that works much later. On Naraka Chaturdashi, the 14th day, on October 18th, 1835, Muthuswami Dikshtar was performing Devi Puja, again as a Sri Vidya Upasaka. He was performing Devi Puja. And after performing Devi Puja, he sang Ehi Annapurne, which is in the Ragam Punnagavarali. And it's said to be his final composition. He then sat down and asked his disciples to sing the magnum opus in Purvi Kalyani, Meenakshi Memudam, which is a beautiful composition. And in the Anupallavi, there's a line that says, Meena Lochani Pasha Mochani, a beautiful line and beautiful poetry in that instance. He actually asked his disciples to repeat this line a few times. And as they repeated it, it is said that Dikshtar said, Shive Pahi, Shive Pahi, Shive Pahi, and passed away. As a true musician, as a true bhakta, as a true devotee, we can truly see that not only did he live a life devoted to the Lord and devoted to spirituality, but even in his passing, he passed while music was happening, while a beautiful lyric was happening, while one of his own compositions was being sung. And that's such a wonderful thing of beauty. As I was thinking about it and singing the composition and contemplating on Meenakshi Memudam, the composition itself, I wondered at the beauty of not only the sahityam, but the wonderful aspect of how that was the last song that he heard, and those were the words that he took, and he attained moksham at that point. So now that we know about Dikshitar's story, let's take a closer look at his compositions and the body of work that he has presented for us. Excuse me, just a moment. In total, Dikshitar is said to have composed anywhere between 400 to 500 compositions. We have about, I believe, 480 that we have today. Spread about over 193 different ragams, many of which are widely sung. You can hear them being sung in temples, you can hear them being sung in concerts. They're taught and handed down from teacher to student and teacher to student. Dikshitar composed in a variety of different languages, Sanskrit, Telugu. He also composed in a few compositions. He has what's called as Manipravalam, which is multiple languages being composed in one song. You can see kind of his lyrical genius in those compositions. His compositions overall are known for the depth of melody as well as lyrical excellence. He was a Vagyakara of the highest level, where he combined not only sahityam or beautiful poetry, along with sangadis, or what we call variations, the actual way the notes are sung. He was able to bring out the beauty of the ragam as well as the beauty of the sahityam and match perfectly, meld the two together perfectly in a beautiful confluence, which is one of the things his compositions are very well known for. He was also a master of layam. Again, the reason why I discussed his father at the beginning of this is because growing up in that style and growing up with the background of his father being a well-known composer who composed in a variety of talams, Dikshitar imbibed that, and he himself composed in a variety of talams. He is one of the only composers to have major kritis in all of the 7 basic talams, or the Sapta Sulali talas as we know them today. The Sapta talas that we use in the alankarams, or the beginning exercises of Carnatic music. Many of his kritis, excuse me, are sets of kritis. I mentioned the Shodasha Ganapati kritis before. There are the Guru Guha Vibhakti kritis, which are some of the very early kritis that he composed in Tirtani. He has also composed the Kamalamba Navavarna kritis, which again are 9 kritis in praise of Kamalamba, with a Pratama Kirtane, or a first Kirtane, as well as a Mangala Kirtane, or an ending kriti, so total 11. He has also composed the Navagraha kritis. For those familiar, the Navagraha kritis are on the 9 grahas, each corresponding to a day of the week as well. So if you're familiar with Chandram Bhajamanasa or Buddham Ashrayami, these kritis are also part of his compositions. Other groups include the Abhyamba Vibhakti kritis and many more. Dikshitar was very well known for composing in sets. He composed solitary kritis as well, and solitary kirtanes, but he was very well known for composing sets of kritis that, when sung together, illuminated the large range of description and the large range of devotion that he had towards a deity, but also highlighted multiple rhythmic aspects as well as raga bhavam aspects. If you notice the Navagraha kritis, again, each of the Navagraha kritis is set in a different talam. And each of the different talams again match the 7 Sapta Alankaram talams that we have. And so that's again one of the major factors of him composing in sets. His compositions, excuse me, contain a great deal of description, a great deal of imagery and detail. As I said earlier, Dikshitar went on pilgrimage. And as he went on pilgrimage, he spent his time analyzing the sannidhis, understanding the temples, understanding the beauty of the Lord or the Devi who was at the temple, and also made mention of philosophy and stories related to those deities. You can find it all in his kritis. He commented on different kinds of philosophy, on Vedanta, etc. 176 kritis of Dikshitar are in praise of Devi. Being a Sri Vidya Upasakar, a majority of his kritis were in praise of Devi, of Amba. And then followed by about 131 kritis on Shiva. Something of note is that Dikshitar is the only major composer who sang in praise of Chaturmukha Brahma that we know of, that we have today. Next, I would like to talk about certain aspects of his kritis. As I was taking the time to not only review the Dikshitar kritis that I know, but also take a lot of time to listen, I wanted to highlight some of the influences that he had and some of the aspects of his kritis that set Dikshitar apart from maybe other composers of the Trinity, other composers that we have in Carnatic music? What are the things that make his compositions stand out? Major influences that he had. One of the major influences is actually Western music. Dikshit is very, very well known for compositions influenced by Western music. For those of us familiar, we know the English Note is a very popular composition that many people hear and many people perform today. Dikshit actually heard a variety of Celtic music tunes. He heard Irish airs, he heard melodies, brass band melodies, when he was in Fort St. George, which again was the base of the East India Company in southern India. Upon the behest of Colonel Brown, who was part of the East India Company, was the ambassador at that point, Dikshit, when he visited with his father, was asked to compose actually text, take Western melodies and set them to Sanskrit and Telugu lyrics, and actually keep the Western tune and sort of the sangadis, or the tune of the Western melodies, but set them to Sanskrit and Telugu lyrics. Compiled today, they're actually called the Nottuswara Sahityam, which are a very specific set of compositions, not a type of composition that you see from a lot of other composers. We only have about 36 compositions available today out of the Nottuswara Sahityam. We only have about 36 in notation. But these compositions are in praise of different deities like Ganesha, like Amba, Shiva, and so on. They do not have the same segments as kritis. In a traditional kriti, we hear a pallavi, an anupallavi, a charanam. We have all these parts. These Nottuswarams do not have the same segments, and are based on simple melodies. They reflect the simple melodies of Western music, the melodies that are based on pure harmony, the melodies that are based on different intervals. They don't have necessarily the ornamentations or the gamakams that are very characteristic of Carnatic music. One of the major reasons why I bring this up is Dikshit himself being influenced by Western music. As he created these Nottuswarams, he actually provided Carnatic music with a very wide body of work over the course of these compositions. One of these compositions was actually converted, many of these actually were converted into Geetams. One of the popular ones that we know is actually Varavina, the Geetam that almost every young child of music who studies music actually learns. This was originally a Nottuswaram of Muthuswami Dikshit. And if you think about the Geetam itself, without the gamakams and without the ornamentation that is characteristic of the ragam, we actually sing it quite plain. Say the same way Dikshit actually composed it when he was inspired by Western music. One of the few composers of that time to be inspired by Western music. I think it's very interesting that these compositions that again come from that inspiration are still being sung today and still represent a part of Carnatic music, a very important part of Carnatic music repertoire that you'll hear being performed by singers, by instrumentalists, and by students of music alike. One of the other major influences of Muthuswami Dikshit is actually the Hindustani music influence. As I mentioned earlier, when he was in Varanasi, Dikshit had the opportunity to not only observe a variety of Drupad musicians, but also listen and learn from them. He diligently studied, as he was there for 7 years, he diligently studied Drupad style of singing. While I am not very familiar with Drupad singing, as I was doing my research, one of the things that I found was the elaboration of raga, both in an alap or alapane format, as we know, but also the sangadis that are created and the gamakams that are used in compositions as well. Drupad compositions are characterized by what's called as the Vilamba kalam, or the Vilambit, very, very slow tempo, as well as a very elaborate presentation of a raga itself. Many of Dikshit's compositions bear Hindustani influences, and you can see his creative genius at taking Hindustani influences, Hindustani ragams, and applying those concepts to a Carnatic composition. Some examples of this include the very popular kriti Jambupate in Yamun Kalyani. The slow gati or gait of the kriti itself is reminiscent of a Drupad Kirtane. Is very reminiscent again of the type of lyrical style of singing, the slow jarus or slides of the singing, as well as the heavy emphasis placed on the poetry and the way the poetry is actually stylized. In this case, in the case of Jambupate, Dikshit transformed Yaman Kalyani and into the Carnatic form and was able to adapt it for the Carnatic form. The delicate sangadis in this kriti, as well as many others, are all inspired by the Drupad form of elaboration. His interpretation of ragams like Dvijavanti, Yaman Kalyani, Hamir Kalyani, Mani Rangu, etc., are not only original, but they take as inspiration from the Hindustani ragam, but they are their own. Many of these compositions serve as a template for the raga outline itself. They serve as the sort of the initial template and the final template for the raga prastaram that we do. When somebody says, you know, Vijavanti or Yaman Kalyani, a lot of times we look at Dikshatar's compositions and we use that as the template when we're understanding the ragam, when we're learning about the ragam, and we're taking the time to improvise in the ragam as well, with improvisation being a large part of Carnatic music. So now that we've discussed kind of Dikshatar's influences, we saw the Western music influence, we saw the Hindustani influence, we see that all of his compositions bear a huge emphasis on sahityam, on ragam, as well as layam. It's important to take a minute and look at his legacy. As we saw with Tyagaraja's Shishyakulam, or Tyagaraja's legacy in the last presentation, his legacy was very much represented by his students. You have major students like Manambu Chavadi Venkata Subbayar, many others who took the time to take his compositions, learn them, notate them, and then bring them to the masses. With Dikshitar, the main line of Dikshitar's pupils really represented by his own family, apart from the Tanjavur quartet, as I mentioned earlier. After Balaswami Dikshitar, Muthuswami Dikshitar's brother, we had Subbarama Dikshitar, who was also a well-known composer and singer in his right. His son was Ambi Dikshitar. Ambi Dikshitar actually succeeded Subbarama Dikshitar as the court musician at Yattayapuram and stayed there for a very long time. Much later in life, Ambi Dikshitar actually migrated to Madras, or Chennai as we know it, where he lived a very long life for the rest of his life. And while in Madras, he actually built a school around himself. And it was sort of the starting point of a very strong movement around Dikshitar Kritis. At this time, the well-known Vedanta Bhagavatar, who is from Kalladakurchi, who also happened to be in Madras at the same time, kind of threw himself enthusiastically into the idea of propagating the Dikshitar Kritis. As I mentioned last time, there were many different musicians who took Tyagaraja Kritis and propagated them at that time. The same thing happened with Dikshitar Kritis, but more so starting from his own family. There were two young Veena brothers of Tirunelveli, actually, Anand Krishna Iyer and Sundaram Iyer, who took the manuscripts that Sri Ambi Dikshitar, again, part of the Dikshitar family, had written, and they made copies of these kritis. They made copies and they actually distributed them, and they formed the basis of how Dikshitar kritis were presented. Of Dikshitar's own direct line, Sri Ambi Dikshitar's son, again, Tiruvarur Baluswami Dikshitar, is one of the representatives that we see later on. It was mainly due to the devotion, the dedication, and truly the strong efforts of Sri Ambi Dikshitar while he was in Madras that the musical heritage of Muthuswami Dikshitar came to be extended outside of the family. The disciples of Ambi Dikshitar, some of them that we know, D.K. Pattamalama was one of them, as well as T.L. Venkatramayar, took great pride and did their service to Dikshitar with great enthusiasm in popularizing his compositions. They took his compositions that they had that existed and popularized them to a great deal. One more piece of interesting information that I want to highlight on. Again, going back to the idea of Western music and how it influenced. The violin, as we know it, is the traditional mode of accompaniment in today's concerts or kacheris. It's almost always the traditional accompanying instrument. It is the instrument that we see most commonly, and it is an instrument that is given great importance, especially if you look at musicians like Lalgudi, Jayaraman, Shri T.N. Krishnan, and M.S. Gopalakrishnan. The Dikshitar family, again being associated with Fort St. George at that time, was that Baluswami, who was Muthuswami's younger brother, actually became fascinated by the fiddle or the violin that was played by the band who actually was in Fort St. George. And Balaswami wanted to take that fiddle and took the sound and said, you know, I think this sounds very akin to the human voice. This is something that I think we can adapt for Carnatic music. And Balaswami learned the fiddle from an Irish musician and soon became very adept in playing Carnatic music. And the entire family, Muthuswami Dikshitar included, they said, you know, we have traditional veena, because the veena at that time was the traditional accompaniment for vocal, considering that veena at that time was considered to be the instrument that accurately, represented the human voice. So the entire family came together, Muthuswami included, and they said, why can't we set out violin as the accompanying instrument for Carnatic music concerts? And so they tried it out, and it worked very well. And as we can see even today, the violin is the indispensable, indisputed accompaniment for a Carnatic music concert, something that you see almost at every single concert that we see today. And I thought that was a very interesting tidbit that I wanted to share. In conclusion, Muthuswami Dikshitar as a composer was a celebrated Vagyakara. He was someone who wove music with lyrics, with ragabhavam all together in a spellbinding format. And not only was he knowledgeable about music, but he was knowledgeable about the Vedas, Vedangas, Jyotisha, Tantra, as well as many more aspects of Indian culture. And you can see that represented in all of his compositions, in many of his compositions, as he describes spiritual aspects, as he describes philosophical ideals. Some people say that listening to Dikshitar's compositions and understanding them is the equivalent of understanding the Purusha Suktam, and equivalent to understanding certain Suktams that we have in the Vedas themselves, because of the level of information and the pure spirituality that is contained in his compositions. His legacy cannot be understated. As a student of music myself, part of the musical community, as Carnatic musicians, we sing Dikshitar compositions all the time. We learn from them, we study them, and we truly take the time to understand them, because by understanding them, we can learn about not only philosophy, we can learn about music itself, we can learn about Sangadis, and so on and so forth. Before I end the presentation, I would like to take a few minutes to sing a very famous composition that I think highlights many of the aspects that I discussed today. This composition is called Mamava Pattabhirama, set to Mishra Chapu, and it's in the raga Manirangu. As I stated earlier, Manirangu is perhaps a lesser known ragam, but this composition is one of the foremost compositions in Manirangu, forms the template for Manirangu as we know it today, and also has the characteristic slow gati or slow tempo that we see in lots of Dikshitar's compositions, again influenced by the Hindustani music style. The Sangadis in this composition, you'll hear a lot of what we call jarus or slides. These slides are very characteristic of Hindustani music, and I think this composition not only highlights those influences of Hindustani music that Dikshitar saw when he was in Varanasi, but it also highlights his sahityam and his ability to transform lyrics and tell a story in just a few lyrics. And the reason why I say that is because this is one of the most beautiful kritis that actually highlights Sri Rama's Pattabhishekam. If you listen to the Charanam, the words go through and highlight his Pattabhishekam in a very beautiful manner, succinct, yet full of description at the same time. One more thing I do want to say about this kriti, again, as we explore the connection between different members of the Trinity, there's a legend that says Muthuswami Dikshitar actually visited Saint Tyagaraja. Knowing of Tyagaraja's devotion of Rama and his great undying devotion to Rama, Muthuswami Dikshitar and his disciples sat down and actually sang this kriti for Tyagaraja as an offering to him himself. So I will sing Mamava Pattabhirama in the raga Manirangu by Muthuswami Dikshitar, set to Mr. Chapu. Mamava Pattabhirama Jaya Maruti Sanmutara Rama Mamava Pattabhirama Maruti Sanmuta Na Ma Rama Ma Virama Jaya Maruti Sannuta Nama Rama Mama Virama Jaya Maruti Sannuta Ma Komaladara Pallava Kodandarama Komaladara Pallava Kodandarama Ghanashamala Vigraham Janayana Sampurna Kamana Purama Kalyana Rama Rama Komaladara Pallava Kodandarama Ghanashamala Vigraham Janayana Sampurna Kamana Purama Kalyana Rama Rama Mama Virama Jaya Maruti Sannuta Nama Rama Amava Patavi Rama Chatra Chamara Karadita Bharata Lakshmana Chatra Chamara Karadita Bharata Lakshmana Shatrugna Vibhishana Sugriva Pramukhadi Sevita Atri Vashishadi Nugraha Patra Dasharata Putra Maniranga Valyalang Kritanavaratna Mantabe Vichitra Manimaya Simhasane Sitayasa Samstita Suchajitra Parama Pavitra Guru Guhamyetra Pankajametra Vamsha Sudha Puri Chandra Medi Ramachandra Mama Patavirama Jaya Maruti Sannuta Nama Rama Patavi Rama Dr. Raju, over to you.
Thank you. Go ahead and chant Hanuman Chalisa, and then we'll have Q&A.
Of course.
Hanuman Chalisa and Mangala Shloka.
श्री गुरु चरण सरोज रज निज मन मुकुर सुधारि बरनौ रघुबर विमल जस जो दायक फलचार बुद्धिहीन तनु जानिके सुमिरो पवन कुमार बल बुद्धि विद्या देहु मोहि हरहु कलेश विकार जय हनुमान ज्ञान गुण सागर जय कपीस तिहु लोक उजागर राम दूत तुलित फल धामा अंजनी पुत्र पवन सुत नामा महावीर विक्रम बजरंगी कुमति निवार सुमत के संगी कंचन भरण विराज सुबेशा कानन कुंडल कुंचित केशा हाथ वज्र और ध्वजा विराजे कांधे मूंज जनेऊ साजे शंकर सुवन केसरी नंदन तेज प्रताप महाजगवंदन विद्यावान गुणी अति चातुर राम काज करिबे को आतुर प्रभु चरित्र सुनिबे को रसिया राम लखन सीता मन बसिया सूक्ष्म रूप धरि सियहि दिखावा विकट रूप धरि लंक जरावा भीम रूप धरि असुर संहारे रामचंद्र के काज सवारे लाए सजीवन लखन जियाए श्री रघुवीर हर्षि उर लाए रघुपति कीन्ही बहुत बड़ाई तुम मम प्रिय भरत सम भाई सहस बदन तुम रोज सिखाए अस कहि श्रीपति कंठ लगावे सनकादिक ब्रह्मादि मुनीषा नारद शारद सहित ईशा यम कुबेर दिगपाल जहाते कवि कोविद कहि सके कहाते तुम उपकार सुग्रीव ही कीना राम मिलाए राजपद दीना तुमरो मंत्र विभीषण माना लंकेश्वर भय सब जग जाना जुग सहस्त्र जो जन पर भानु लील्यो ताहि मधुर फल जानु प्रभु मुद्रिका मिली मुख माही चल दिलांगे गए अचरज नाई दुर्गम काज जगत के जेते सुगम अनुग्रह तुम्हारे तेते राम दुआरे तुम रखवारे होत न आज्ञा बिनु पैसारे सब सुख लहे तुम्हारी शरणा तुम रक्षक काहू को डरना आपन तेज समारो आपे तीनों लोक हांकते कापे पिशाच निकट नहीं आवे महावीर जब नाम सुनावे नासे रोग हरे सब पीरा जपत निरंतर हनुमत बीरा संकट से हनुमान छुड़ावे मन क्रम वचन ध्यान जो लावे सब पर राम तपस्वी राजा तिनके काज सकल तुम साजा और मनोरथ जो कोई लावे सोई अमित जीवन पल पावे चारों जुग प्रताप तुम्हारा है प्रसिद्ध जगत उजियारा साधु संत के तुम रखवारे असुर निकंदन राम दुलारे अष्ट सिद्धि नव निधि के दाता अस पर दीन जानकी माता राम रसायन तुम्हारे पासा सदा रहो रघुपति के दासा तुम्हारे भजन राम को पावे जन्म जन्म के दुख बिसरावे अंत काल रघुबरपुर जाई जहाँ जन्म हरि भक्त कहाई और देवता चित्त न धरई हनुमत से ही सर्व सुख करई संकट कटे मिटे सब वीरा जो सुमिरै हनुमत बलबीरा जय 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 हनुमान गोसाई, कृपा करो गुरुदेव की नाई। 64 बार पाठ कर कोई, छूट ही बंदी महा सुख होई। जो यह पढ़े हनुमान चालीसा, होय सिद्धि साखी गौरीशा। तुलसीदास सदा हरि चेरा, की जय नाथ हृदय मानेरा। पवन तनय संकट हरण, मंगल मूर्ति रूप। राम लखन सीता सहित, हृदय बसहु सुरभूप। सियावर रामचंद्र की जय, पवन सुत हनुमान की जय। उमापति महादेव की जय, राधावर कृष्ण चंद्र की जय। बोलो रे भाई सब संतन की जय, कि अपने गुरुदेव की जय, कि अपने मात पिता की जय। Thank you.
Can you do a Mangal Shloka? Yeah.
Of course. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om. Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Hari Om.
Thank you. Thank you so much for giving such a succinct and yet complete information about a great yogi and a great personality and Vageyakara Dikshitar. I first invite the two professionals who could comment, Shamala ji and Lata ji, if she's there, to comment, and then we lay people can comment afterwards. Shamala ji, Lata ji.
Yes. Hello, Jahnavi. Well done. Okay, I had been following your music. Okay, I heard you have a circle of young musicians, and I heard you singing Kamalamba Samrakshadu in Ananda Bhairavi Ragam, right?
Yes.
Very nice. Do you know all the 9 Navavrana Kritis?
I am familiar with, I've learned 3, but I'm familiar with all of them, but I've properly learned 3. So I hope to complete my study of that within the next year. They take a while to learn and understand and internalize and properly sing. So that is something that I hope to do hopefully within the next year.
Very good. You know, I know some of them, not all of them, but I had the good fortune to study the Sahityam in detail in reference to Sri Chakra. So I love the philosophy behind it, and I had done it. But I heard you. What is that circle of musicians that you are going through?
So are you talking about the organization that I sang for, oh yeah, so that was a young musicians organization. We have obviously a large community of younger musicians in the United States, and that was a young group of musicians who started an organization, and they started an organization through COVID to try and propel not only music but also healing through music as well.
Very good. It sounded very challenging, you know, to see the young people doing so good. Wish you all the best. Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Did you mean Lakshmi, Dr. Raju? I don't think
I meant Lakshmi. I meant Lakshmi ji. So sorry.
I didn't see her today.
Okay. So anyone else before I just take a couple of minutes? Anyone else want to comment, compliment?
Jahnavi, a beautiful narration of the story of another Vageyakaras with Swami Dikshitar. Someday when you finish all 3 of them, would you be able to give a concert with all the music they composed one by one if possible? Thank you.
Of course. Absolutely. I'd be happy to. I truly would be happy to.
Thank you.
Well, Janavi, I am not only impressed, I am awed by your presentation and the singing. Thank you, and looking forward to seeing many more.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Anyone else? We have time. Dr. Dani Reddy, Dr. Jatla, and Rishiji. Yeah.
I'm an ignorant person in music, but you know, music, you don't need to understand music to feel the divinity in it.
Very true.
Jahnavi, I truly felt I'm getting closer to God when I listen to you singing. And I know nothing about the ragas and all the other things you mentioned, but we listen, we hear these songs all the time, never knowing who wrote them and what the history behind it. And I'm quite impressed with your command of you know, the history of these great composers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Murali Jatla. I know when I say Murali, then, you know, so there's always a confusion between your dad and Murali.
Raju, thank you. Yeah, Jahnavi, it's amazing. You know, my family was listening to how much you know about the history, and they were saying, I can't believe she can talk nonstop without having to catch her breath about, and that just tells us about, you know, your passion and true dedication to your art. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Guru Garu, Girija Garu. They're all our teachers, and they know a lot about either the Sahitya part or Sangeeta part or the philosophy part of it. So in fact, you know, all these compliments are coming from great people who know the various aspects of what you said. Dr. Biram, Radha, or anyone, please, Rishiji. Okay, so if there are no comments, Jahnavi, thank you. I just want to echo what Dr. Venkatrao Garu has said, that actually after maybe one session about intro of Vagyekara and the next session about their songs, because you just left me you know, for next 1 month to listen to all Dikshitar's Navavarana Kritis, Navagraha Kritis. So fortunately, Shamalaji is doing Navagraha Kritis for us, just one Kriti, one session. So we just did Surya Kriti, and I think next one will be Chandra. The meaning of it. So like you said, it's a text. It's actually when you read a Kriti of Dikshitar and beautiful Sanskrit, his yati or his prasa or the words chosen, it's like a nice scripture, as you said, like maybe the explanation of Purusha Sukta or Sri Sukta, and with his Sri Chakra Upasana, the Navavarana Kritis, the technical aspects of it, which you know, an ordinary layman, you know, I can't understand, but I could understand how much of that has gone into it. And the language part of it also, even when we were learning vibhaktis in Sanskrit, like, you know, there are some Sanskrit students like, you know, Ramaha, Ramam, Ramena, like that. The Guru Guha vibhaktis are so beautiful, and other vibhaktis also. But what I was not aware of was Shodasha Ganesha Kritis. So maybe you can take a minute to explain them.
Yeah, of course. So
Yeah.
the Shodasha Ganapati Kritis were composed after Dikshithar returned back to Tiruvarur, after his visit to Tirthani. He composed 16 Kritis on Ganapati. The Mahaganapatam that I sang at the beginning is actually part of that set. And what I think is interesting is, as compositions necessarily, right? We have so many Kritis on Shiva, on Amba, on Rama. And Ganapati, even though we pray to Ganapati at the beginning, you know, of almost every endeavor that we undertake, a lot of times compositions wise, we might necessarily see less compositions or perhaps not as many. And I think what's very interesting is that Muthuswami Dikshita took the time and created the Shorasha Ganapati Kritis. And in these Kritis, he actually talks about not only the different forms of Ganesha, he talks about different stories. It's also said that Ganesha is depicted in 16 different forms as well in certain scriptures. And those 16 forms are what Dikshita actually composed. Theoretically, there's this theory that he composed on those 16 forms as well.
Thank you. So I'll ask you privately, you know, where I can get them, or you know how I can listen to them. And we, you know, coming from Ganesha temple, and then also we heard from Shamalaji about Amrita Varshini, Ananda Amrita Karshini, also Varshaya Varshaya, Stambhaya Stambhaya, and then Gopucha and Srotavaha, you know,
Yes,
like
the Yatis
tapering
as well,
and then elaborating. So maybe like one day just concert of each one or all of them together. Yeah, thank you.
Of course, I'd be happy. I'd be really happy to take the time. I think for me, it's also, I'm very fortunate. It truly is a blessing to be able to take the time to study music like this and to study the compositions like this. It truly is a blessing for me to be able to do that. So thank you for the opportunity, because it gives me a chance to truly learn from that as well.
And these are all recorded and they are actually on YouTube. Dr. Nair, over to you.
Well, it was a great presentation and another great night. Janavi, we are looking forward to having you again very soon. And with that, Shubharatri, everyone. And we'll close the shop for the time being. See you all at 7 o'clock tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you.